Last week, I shared with you the shady shit the US got up to during the Cold War era in Greenland, and this week we are diving into the golden age of Arctic exploration, the heyday of white men traveling around the world claiming land and artifacts that were never theirs to claim. If you've ever been to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, you might recognize this huge rock. It's actually a meteor, and it sits right in the center of the Arthur Ross Hall of Meteorites. So when you're looking at the meteorite in the museum, there's a placard that will tell you that it's called the 𝗗cie⁄ meteorite, that it's estimated to be 4.5 billion years old, that it weighs 34 tons, and that it is the largest meteorite on display in any museum in the world. What that placard will not tell you is the true history of how the meteorite came to be at the American Museum of Natural History and who else was on board the ship that brought it to the US. And that is our story for today. The year is 1894. Enter our poster child for white male privilege, Robert Peary. He's American, he's extremely racist, and he is obsessed with being the first person to reach the North Pole. He's actually pretty much like the worst traveler you could ever imagine. Over the course of his life, he'll spend 20 years going back and forth to Greenland. He will barely learn the language, and he will, until he dies, continue to refer to grown-ass Greenlanders as being childlike. By contrast, his expedition partner, Matthew Henson, who would go on to be the first Black explorer invited to join the prestigious Explorers Club, learned to speak the local Inuit language fluently and pretty quickly. So Robert Peary and Matthew Henson go to Greenland to explore the ice cap, and while they're there, Peary learns about these 3 magical meteorites that the local Inuit have a lot of respect for. The local Greenlanders use them very sparingly to create tools, and they believe that the meteorites are protected, and if you take more from them than you need, you will essentially be cursed. Peary has been in the Arctic for almost 2 years now, and he has nothing to show for his time there. So he's like, light bulb. I can steal these meteorites, take them back to the US, and distract people with the meteorites so that no one will realize that my entire mission to Greenland was actually a flop. So he forces a Greenlander to take him to the meteorites. He literally carves his name into one of them and is like, this is mine now. Peary is a very powerful person in the Arctic because whenever he comes for an expedition, he brings supplies to trade with the Greenlanders. So the Greenlanders can't say no to Peary, otherwise they risk losing their only access to very essential supplies. So it takes him a couple years, but eventually Peary's able to steal all 3 meteorites from the Greenlanders. And the last trip is for the largest meteorite, which his daughter christens herself with her own middle name, 𝗗cie⁄ which is probably an anglicized version of the Greenlandic name 𝗗cie⁄ The meteorite is 34 tons. They have to carry it over a mile to get to the ship. Matthew Henson helps carrying and helps get it onto the ship, and then they set sail for the US. So 2 of the Greenlanders who had helped carry the 34-ton meteorite were named 𝗗cie and 𝗖cie. And Peary had promised them that as a reward for helping him, he would bring them and their families to New York for a year. So not only on that ship was there a 34-ton meteorite stolen from the Greenlanders, but there were 6 Greenlanders themselves. There was 𝗗cie, his wife 𝗗cie, their 12-year-old daughter 𝗖vicke, 𝗖vicke's promised husband-to-be 𝗖cie⁺ who didn't want her going to the US alone, and then there was 𝗖cie and his son 𝗏𝗏, who was 7 years old. You've probably guessed that there's some shady shit going on in the background right now. Peary, not the kind of guy to give away a free vacation. He is motivated by one thing and one thing only, and that is getting to the North Pole. But Arctic expeditions, very expensive. Pretty much means he's constantly trying to fundraise and getting good PR so he can confirm his next trip to the Arctic. And he also has a very special relationship to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City because one of its co-founders, 𝗵𝗵𝗿𝗄 Jessup, is his benefactor, aka his cash cow. So it turns out that Franz Boas, who is on staff at the museum and will go on to become a very famous anthropologist, had sort of whispered in Peary's ear before this trip, wouldn't it be so cool if you brought back one Inuit from Greenland so that we can study him? And Peary, who I have mentioned before, is a racist piece of shit and does not see Greenlanders as having self-agency, decides that he's going to trick not 1, but 6 Greenlanders into coming back to the US, and that will make him have 6 times the amount of prestige and goodwill from the museum. So the first warning sign that all is not as it seems is that Perry jumps ship before they even get to New York. He gets up early and takes a different boat down to Washington, D.C., and then never checks in on the Greenlanders ever again. I told you, he's a terrible person. So the ship docks in Brooklyn, and there are 20,000 people waiting to see the Greenlanders and the meteorite. And they're like all up on the ship, they have their hands all over the Greenlanders, they're giving the kids candy, and Matthew Henson is acting as their translator, and eventually he's like, okay, time to take you up to the museum. Perry told me to take you there. And it turns out that even though Perry had all this time to tell all these reporters that he was coming with the Greenlanders and the meteorite, he didn't actually tell the American Museum of Natural History that he was bringing them. So don't get me wrong, they were thrilled to have people to study because they are based off of white supremacy, but they didn't have any plans for what to do with them. So all of a sudden they have 6 Greenlanders that they need to house and feed, and they decide that the best place to put them is in the basement of the museum. It is an unseasonably warm autumn in New York that year. The Greenlanders are hot. They've had thousands and thousands of people staring at them, trying to see them, and now they are living in a dank, musty basement. And then the Greenlanders start to get sick, and 𝗖cie is the first to pass away from TB and pneumonia. The museum hosts a small funeral for him on their grounds so that 𝗵𝗵 can attend, and then the museum moves the rest of the Greenlanders to upstate New York, but it is way too little, way too late, and 𝗏𝗏, 𝗏𝗏, and 𝗖𝗏𝗏 all pass away from TB and pneumonia. So the only Greenlanders left alive out of the original 6 now are 𝗖cie_𝗁𝗏 and 𝗵𝗵, who is now 8 years old and an orphan. 𝗖cie_𝗁𝗏 is like, get me the fuck out of this country, and he goes with Perry on his next trip up to Greenland that summer. But 𝗵𝗵, who has been living with a family in New York, the Wallaces, stays in New York because the Wallaces essentially decide they want to keep him in New York. It's unclear whether 𝗵𝗵 wanted to stay, but stay he does. So a couple years pass, and 𝗵𝗵's doing really well. He considers the Wallaces to be his family. He's going to school. But one day he comes home crying from school because the kids have been making fun of him, and they've been saying and taunting him that his father is in the museum. And 𝗵𝗵's very confused because he was at his father's funeral, so he knows that his father's buried at the museum, but he's not in the museum. And that is when William Wallace, who is his foster father, sits 𝗵𝗵 down and tells him the truth, which is that the American Museum of Natural History put on a fake funeral for 𝗵𝗵, so that what they could do instead was take his father, 𝗖𝗁𝗏's body, do an autopsy on it, then clean the bones to put him on display in the museum. And how does Wallace know this? Wallace knows this because he was working at the museum, and he helped organize the fake funeral. And not only that, but the bones of 𝗖cie and all of the Greenlanders who died under the museum's care were washed at his house upstate. And now, since bringing 𝗵𝗵 into his life and into his family, he's realized what a fucking horrible thing he was a part of. And he knew that this day would come when he would have to sit 𝗵𝗵 down and tell him what had actually happened to his father. And on 𝗵𝗵's behalf, 𝗵𝗵 has just learned that the one other family member that he loves and cares for, the only people that he knows in the US, were directly responsible for covering up the fake funeral of his father. But 𝗵𝗵 believes in Wallace's deep regret and for Wallace's love for 𝗵𝗵, and so together they decide to make it their mission to get the bones back from the American Museum of Natural History. Whew, but that fucking American Museum of Natural History, they will not even acknowledge their request, and if reporters or anyone asks them about it, the bones, they are very wishy-washy about the bones even being in the museum, whether they're there or not, they won't confirm. And on top of that, they cut off all ties with the Wallace family because there had been several members of the Wallace family working at the museum. They don't anymore. And then on top of that, the Wallace family loses all of their fortune, and 𝗵𝗵 ends up living in poverty with the Wallaces. But they still have friends and people who really strongly believe in 𝗵𝗵's case, and they even managed to get it to the White House to try to get this all figured out. But no one will help 𝗵𝗵 because acknowledging 𝗵𝗵's plight means acknowledging there's a problem, which means bad PR for Perry. And Perry has friends in very high places, and he is still trying to get to the North Pole. So in an interesting twist of fate, 𝗵𝗵 at this time has also been simultaneously trying to get back to Greenland, but there's never been a ship that could take him. But now that he's causing such a stir and a ruckus and a noise about Perry and the bones, Perry's wife, who doesn't want any bad PR for her husband, basically is willing to ship 𝗵𝗵 to Greenland herself. And 𝗵𝗵 realizes that the American Museum of Natural History is probably never going to give him the bones of his father back, but now he does have a chance to go home. So he takes it, and in 1909, 12 years after 𝗵𝗵 left Greenland, he goes home. 𝗵𝗵 has a really hard time in Greenland. He has to relearn his mother tongue, he has to learn how to hunt and survive in the Arctic, and he has to try to fit into a culture that he doesn't really know anymore. And he constantly feels like an outsider. So in 1916, he voluntarily comes back to the US, and he ends up going to New Hampshire, where he becomes friends with a family in New Hampshire, and he has the best years of his life with them working in New Hampshire until he dies of the Spanish flu in 1918. And you can actually go visit his grave in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, right on the border with Canada. I learned about this whole story through this book, 𝗵𝗵, the New York Eskimo, by Ken Harper, who, yes, is a white man. He's lived in the Canadian Arctic for 50 years, speaks the Inuit language there, and is very dedicated to this story. When the book was originally published in 1986, the American Museum of Natural History was still holding on to the public position that the bones of all 4 Greenlanders should remain in the museum. But then in 1990, the Native American Grave and Burial Protection Act is passed, and that means that American museums are required to give skeletal remains back to Native groups who have a valid claim on them. And while this doesn't apply to Greenlanders since they aren't Native American, it does mean that public opinion had switched enough that the American Museum of Natural History agreed to quietly send back the bones to Greenland. And so in 1993, the bones of 𝗗cie his𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗲, 𝗬𝗏, and 𝗖𝗵𝗍 are all buried in 𝗏𝗏, Greenland, almost 100 years after they were tricked in coming to the US. But that meteorite, you can still see it at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Just don't expect to learn any of this stuff there.